Hi everyone, welcome back to this series on the levels of spirituality. Today we're continuing on with one of the other main levels in this system, and today it is secular spirituality. Welcome to the Deep Psychology Podcast. I'm your host Ross Edwards, author, coach and podcaster. We cover deep insights into your psychology, helping you grow in psyche and spirit. Make sure to subscribe to Deep Psychology on Spotify or Apple to stay up to date. You can also visit the website deep-psychology.com, visited by tens of thousands of people every month for lots of free resources. If you want to go deeper with this work, you might like to do coaching with me, head to the website for more details. It's time for today's episode. So, secular spirituality. I can guarantee that if you're listening to this, you've probably gone through this stage of spiritual development. You're possibly beyond it. You're possibly around this stage. I can imagine that most of my listeners are either there or beyond. So we all probably know what this is. However, we've maybe just never really thought of it as a legitimate stage of spirituality before. We may, like we do with traditional spirituality, have judged it as being wrong, as being sort of fundamentally corrupted in a certain way, as being a malignant force. And what I'll remind you about the levels of spirituality is that these undergird human history. If you look back in human history, you can see hundreds of years of the dominance of traditional spirituality, and then you can see secular spirituality come online, and then you can see the next levels come online. So these aren't just stupid stages that humans go through because we're ignorant or something like that. This is just a developmental process. This is how we move forward. This is how we evolve and change. So it's natural that we, as a society, as collectives, go through a secular spiritual phase. And it's normal that as individuals we go through it. It's just the trajectory of human development, because these stages form the basis of that. And we should expect them to appear whenever we study development. So just a reminder that the three main stages we're looking at this month are traditional religious spirituality, secular modern spirituality, and progressive postmodern spirituality. So last week we covered traditional, and this week we're covering secular modern. So I'll also remind you before we get going with secular spirituality, because that might seem like a bit of a contradiction in terms, How can it be spiritual but be secular at the same time? Well, let me remind you that spirituality is how we relate and how we sort of conceptualize what is absolutely true, what is the fundamental nature of existence. So that can be defined, we can understand that in a theistic way, but we can also understand it in a non-theistic, atheistic way. And that is basically what secular spirituality does. It asks these questions and pretty much answers them in negative terms all the time. We're going to talk about this more. But because it does that, because it answers these questions, or it gives its own... It has its own answer, it has its own way of understanding these topics. It is a form of spirituality, okay? So let's look at the key forms of secular spirituality so that we're all on the same page and you know what I'm talking about. And I'd say, again, just to kind of take the pressure off that, and I said this last week, that we all know what secular spirituality is. We've all experienced it. We've all, as I said, most people listening, I suspect, have at least gone through it and come out the other side, or perhaps you're in it right now. We all know what it is, okay, and It's just a matter of putting a label on things that we already recognize, but perhaps haven't really realized the significance of it. Most of us, again, if you're listening to this, I suspect that you were brought up in a secular education system, in a largely secular society, and that basically, in your formative years, when you were going through pre-conventional and conventional stages of development, you were in a secular surround, right? So this is interesting because it helps us understand our own past and how we have come to be who we are. But the trick with it is that the fish cannot see the water, right? That old cliche. When we're brought up in a secular background, we cannot see our secular biases, our secular epistemology, our secular worldview, our secular frame of meaning, and all the rest of it. So it becomes hard to see that. So this will help you shine a light on that, help you understand secular spirituality. So where does secular spirituality show up? What are the forms of it? I spoke about how traditional spirituality shows up in organized religion mostly. So secular spirituality shows up in atheism, agnosticism, mainstream academia, mainstream media, science. Okay, so really the modern truth systems of all kind are usually kind of correlated with secular spirituality. Secular spirituality is anti-spiritual or aspiritual, mostly, because what it typically does is it defines itself in opposition to other forms of spirituality. It defines itself by how it rejects them. So it's like how an atheist is defined by the fact that they don't believe in a God. They believe there is no God, no supernatural being. It's the same thing. It's defined by the fact it doesn't believe that there is sort of an ultimate reality, that there's a fundamental nature to our existence. In fact, one of my favourite philosophers when it comes to these topics, called Steve McIntosh, I'd really recommend you read his stuff on politics, on spirituality. It's really great. He calls secular spirituality aspirituality. So you could call it secular, but you can think of it as aspiritual. It's aspirituality. It's defined by the absence of spirituality in a sense. So on the other hand, though, when you actually look more deeply at things like atheism, agnosticism, science, mainstream academia, and so on, they do actually make a lot of claims about what is absolutely true. They're quite certain about a lot of things when it comes to sort of the ultimate meaning of life and what is sort of the ultimate driving force, what is the ultimate force in the universe. I mean, they may give a lot of different answers to that, but typically it's within a certain epistemological frame. And so in that sense, it's spiritual. Because remember, spiritual just means what is absolutely true, what is the fundamental nature of our existence. What it does, though, it doesn't base its spirituality on things like the Bible or scripture, or even practices like meditation and contemplation. What it does is it bases it on science and demonstrable fact and rationality. Okay, so this is where it shows up. Whenever you hear people talking about, well, science tells us that 13.8 billion years ago there was a Big Bang, and that was the start of everything. That was the driving force behind everything. That is a secular idea. That is secular spirituality. And what you'll notice about secular spirituality is it always demands that something is either demonstrable, measurable, or proven by science. And if it's not, it usually is not considered worthy of our attention. However, it might sound, when we think about atheism, agnosticism, mainstream academia, and, aspirituality, as Steve McIntosh calls it, it might sound kind of dry and sort of cynical and kind of, a bit sort of soulless and heartless. However, if you actually look a bit closely, what you'll find, even in like the most hardcore scientists who are really against the idea of God or some kind of ultimate environment, in a spiritual sense, what you'll notice is that they actually have a very deep reverence for things like science and maths and physics and the cosmos. So I would actually argue that their idea of an ultimate reality is simply the cosmos. It's the physical world. We're going to talk about this in a minute. So they certainly have a spiritual life. It's just not, it's not got the supernatural, sort of all-encompassing. It's not so much about divinity and a divine intelligence. It's more just about the workings of the universe that can be measured and understood. However, there is a certain solemnity and reverence for science and maths and so on that sometimes borders on the religious. Secular spirituality came online with the Western Enlightenment. Obviously, there's many countries in the world that are dominated still by traditional spirituality, but when you look at the West, came online during the Western Enlightenment 200, 300 years ago. And as I said, these stages come online chronologically, and you can see that, traditional spirituality dominated for thousands of years. Think Christianity, think, all the war that happened because of Christianity. Think of all the great religions. And then, 200, 300 years ago, all of a sudden we get secular spirituality. And then later to that, we get postmodern progressive spirituality. It typically appears in teenage years. Let's say you're brought up in a religious background and eventually you become more secular minded. Often it comes online in teenage years, when you start to want to not just obey, your parents and your family and your school and just taking everything they say and on face value and your church community and so on. And you start asking questions for yourself, and you maybe start reading books about science, and in school you're learning about maths and physics and chemistry, and you're in a sort of mainstream education. It typically comes online then. I didn't really go through traditional spirituality. I suppose I did, but there was a lot of secular undertones there as well. But when I really felt that I was in a secular spiritual phase was when I was in my teenage years, and I got really into watching YouTube videos about, documentaries about physics and about chemistry and about the cosmos and all of this. And I used to love watching videos of really strong atheists and scientific minded people sort of disproving religion, or at least I thought they were disproving it. And that was when I was a teenager. This is when we lose our religion. So the transition from traditional spirituality to secular spirituality is often the phase where we lose our religion. We suddenly realize that all the scripture and all the biblical truths and all the doctrines of traditional religion are, do not stand up to scientific scrutiny, and we just cannot continue to make our meaning based on those. And this is a trick with secular spirituality, because it's a spirituality. Large swathes of the Western population are actually followers of a spirituality or secular spirituality, pretty devout followers in their own way, but it's really an implicit thing. They don't understand that they are still engaging in spirituality, even in denying other forms of it very vehemently. They are still spiritual followers in their own way, and I think that's an interesting perspective to take on this whole thing. So what's the epistemology underlying secular spirituality? We've talked about this a little bit, but I just want to make it very stark and very clear. So there is no God in the secular spiritual system. It's atheistic. God goes from being everywhere to being nowhere. And in fact, this is the only stage of development where that is true. All other stages of spiritual development will happily say yes to the question, is there a God? Is there some sort of supernatural intelligence guiding this whole thing? Is there some sort of higher power? All other stages of spiritual development will say yes. Secular spirituality is literally the only one that refuses to make positive truth claims. It will only make negative truth claims. In other words, it will only say, no, there is not a supernatural power. No, there is no bigger meaning. There is no divinity, and so on. It will not say yes, right? And this is the only stage. So it's that's a fascinating thing to remember. Under this epistemology, there is nothing unseen. So if we cannot see it, measure it, understand it rationally, if we cannot access it with our ordinary senses, then it's not real, because there is nothing unseen. There is nothing spiritual in that sense. The universe is simply its physical form. The only reality is physical reality. And as such, we are physical beings in a three-dimensional world. So this is, this, if you look at the scientific writers of our time, if you look at the great scientists of the past, if you look at atheists, this is their basic epistemology. And often they don't realize it as an epistemology, because to do so would be to realize that they're actually framing everything in terms of that paradigm, and it would make their own paradigm conscious to them. And because they are locked into it, that will not happen. Their mind will not let that happen. They frame everything in terms of it without realizing it, without realizing that that is actually a paradigm, in the same way that, using the Bible as a way to understand everything is also a paradigm. Secular spiritual people will not realize that. They cannot realize it. Okay? Obviously, if you've studied physics to any fairly advanced level, you'll realize that in the last 100 years, physics has really sort of pulled the rug out from its own feet when it talks about a physical universe. Basically in classical physics, the model of the world was that there were, and this goes actually back to Greek times. Goodness me, I'm going to get very geeky here. Greek philosophers, I'm pretty sure it was Greece, basically said that there has to be a fundamental unit of reality. There has to be a point where if we theoretically cut something down, if we took like a piece of wood and we cut it and we cut it and we cut it and we cut it and we cut it, eventually we'd get to a point where we couldn't cut it. There has to be fundamental units. And no cut, atom is actually Greek for no cut, or Latin. It means no cut, unable to cut anymore, right? So the classical model of reality was that basically it was physical down to its very fundamental structure, right? And this was emphasized for many years, centuries, by models of the atom that were basically like mini solar systems. Of course, there was space in between, say, the nucleus of the atom and the electrons that orbited it, supposedly in a deterministic fashion. We'll get to that. But fundamentally, the atom was a solid thing. Now, what quantum mechanics, and so basically, yes, what I'm saying is that when we look at a wall, for example, it's fundamentally made up of bits of stuff. And if you go down to the essence of the bits of stuff, that is made of more bits of stuff. Some like physical mass, right? And that is basically how, if you look at Isaac Newton's theories, if you look at pretty much all the kind of fundamental physics that in classical physics, classical mechanics and so on, it's based on the idea of mass, that the world is physical, right? So that's fine. What quantum mechanics has shown is that mass is actually a kind of illusion. Electrons do not orbit the atom deterministically, they're actually probabilistic, and they behave in very strange ways. Subatomic particles are even stranger than that. And basically, the world around us is, I can't remember how many nines there are, but it's 99.999999% empty space. There is literally nothing there. There's nothing, but it's not that there's nothing there. I don't think that's true either. But there's no mass in the conventional sense of the word. And then when you look at things like Einstein's theories of relativity, when we start taking linear time and the idea of mass and questioning that, what we see is that, and then there's many other stuff within quantum mechanics that call all of this into question. And what it's really done is it's put this idea of determinism and the idea of mass and predictability really under a lot of question. And what scientists have done in the last sort of 50 years is, obviously there's a lot of people working in quantum mechanics right now. Of course, that is still a huge area of investigation. But what happened at some point was we realized that quantum mechanics helped us do a lot of things in the world. And so a lot of scientists just stopped asking about the implications of it, possibly because they were existentially threatened by it, and they just started inventing things with it. Okay, so this, even from the scientific point of view, which is usually the evidence used for physicality and a 3D world, linear time, and all the rest of it, science is now pulling the rug out from under its own feet with that. And I think my point of view on this is that reality is, in some ways it's everything we think it to be, and it's none of it. There is a God, but there's also a physical world. Both of them are true, and there doesn't have to be a contradiction between them, but they're not absolutely true. They have their limitations as ways of understanding things. And ultimately, reality is beyond conception, right? So I personally don't see a problem with the idea of mass. It's a useful concept that's helped us do a lot of things. Doesn't mean it's absolutely true, not necessarily, but it certainly is a useful concept. So let's look at some of the plus points of secular spirituality. I've covered a few of these. One is that it does away with religious myth and superstition that dominated humanity since our inception. Not just religious, but just myth and superstition in general has dominated humanity since the very beginning, 200,000 years ago. From the time we started trying to make sense of things, it's been done in a pre-rational way, which, when you get to rational, you realize how limited it is. And what secular spirituality does is it comes along with this huge critique of traditional religion and traditional myth and all of the rest of it, and the sort of religious epistemology, and it just says that is all a load of nonsense, and it gives a lot of cogent evidence for that, and that is a very good thing, because without it, we possibly would still be in the Middle Ages. It sees the genuine downsides of religion. It sees the sort of, the hypocrisy, the dogmatism, the sort of inherent contradictions within it. It sees its limitations. It sees that it sees the epistemological errors in it, and it just wants to do away with it. And in many countries, it's done a good job from its own point of view. It undergirds the worldview necessary for modern medicine, science, engineering, and mathematics, and so on, which is great, because look at what this has done. It's completely transformed our lives. The postmodernists will say, it's destroying the planet and we're all going to end up under the sea. Okay, it's true that it's damaging, But we also have to recognize that it's transformed the world in ways that a few hundred years ago we could never have imagined. It has a genuine reverence for things like maths, physics, space, the cosmos. Even if it's not thought of as a religious thing, it actually borders, as I said, on a religious sense of devotion to these things. And this is, it helps people maintain their spiritual life in that way. Even if it has a sort of nihilistic bend to it, which we'll get to. It frees people from the stifling rigidity, dogma, and one-mindedness of religious spirituality. It helps people move from traditional to modern consciousness, which, as I said, is a huge move for humanity. After the millennia of traditional consciousness and all the war and all the divisive religious systems and the repressive social systems, once we move into modern consciousness, we become a lot more peaceful, open, cooperative, and we just do not want to war with each other anymore. It demands evidence and objectivity, which, up until that came online in human history, that was just not a thing. The evidence was, what does a priest say? What does the Bible say? What did Jesus say? What does the authority say? It was really just, it was based on authority figures. It wasn't based on objectivity. And so what objectivity has done has freed us from just having to believe in what the priest says, in what the Bible says. And it's allowed us to look to sort of, first of all, gain our own knowledge. And it's sort of broadened the playing field of who has authority over knowledge in our society. Of course, now you might argue, well, it's the universities and it's the researchers and it's people with money and it's the capitalists. I mean, that is certainly true, but ultimately it's a step forward from what we had before. And really, it continues to exert a hugely positive influence on Western society because it's just continuing to move us from traditional consciousness to modern consciousness. And it's doing this worldwide because of the fact that Western society has such a huge influence worldwide. So that said, let's even if you don't agree with it, and I don't really agree with it in many ways, let's give it its due. Let's understand what role it's played and what role it continues to play. However, let's also look now at the negative points to finish off this talk. So, first of all, I think it's highly arrogant. It doesn't realize that it's literally, well, first of all, it doesn't realize it's a stage of development. So it's not the be-all, end-all. It's a stage. And it doesn't realize it's the only stage that is aspiritual, which is very arrogant. It's quite a depressing, the spirituality it gives us can be quite depressing. And I think it's one of the reasons in the modern world we feel a sort of malaise and a sort of disconnection and a sort of nihilism, because for years we're taught that fundamentally reality is just lifeless matter. It's neutrons and protons and electrons at the fundamental level, or it's, subatomic particles randomly, whizzing around. It's rather depressing compared to what you might be taught at Catholic school, that God is looking over you and God loves you and he wants you to do good and he wants you to, be the best person you can and so on. It's depressing. And what I find in a lot of people who are basically at secular spirituality, that's where they are in their spiritual development, they have just a kind of deadness to them, to be pretty blunt about it. They're just, they're not lit up inside. They don't see the world as magical and alive. They just see it as, it's just life, and it's just that this is how things are, and I'm just a human living this life that is ultimately meaningless, and I'm here for a while and then I die and that's it. It's pretty depressing. It also uproots tradition and family because, traditional spirituality fits very well with sort of local traditions, national identity, family rituals, and so on. And secular spirituality fits more with the modern individualist mindset, which says, I'm going to move away from my family. I'm going to go to the city and I'm going to earn a lot of money and, I'm going to climb the corporate ladder. And, our traditional moorings are lost. And that is a good thing in certain ways, but it's also a pretty depressing thing. Part of the charm of traditional life, the traditional worldview, is this deep connection to family and nation and identity and so on. It believes that atheism is the highest epistemological stance, which I'm not going to explain why it is not, but it just isn't, right? Epistemology is also subject to levels of development, and atheism is just a stage. It is a rational epistemological system, and there are post-rational epistemological systems that transcend and include atheism. So it simply is not the highest, but as you'll know, atheists like to believe that they have the highest epistemological system, and that is an enormous blind spot. Another downside is that it typically defines itself by what it is not. So it's saying, we are not theists, we don't believe in a supernatural power, we do not want to get involved with your religion, but often it doesn't offer much of an alternative, much of a sort of inspiring kind of guiding framework for what everything is, for what life is all about. And so that's why it becomes a bit nihilistic and a bit, people are sort of left sort of cut adrift by it. It mistakes spirituality for traditional spirituality. So even though post-rational stages bring back spirituality in a less sort of dogmatic way than traditional spirituality does, secular spirituality doesn't really understand that. It just sees, it says all spirituality is traditional, it's dogmatic, it's one-minded, it's mythic, and so let's just throw all of spirituality under the bus. Obviously it doesn't consciously say that to itself, but that's what it does. And this is a huge mistake because it's simply not true that all spirituality falls into that category. It itself is a kind of religion, but it doesn't realize this. Steve McIntosh says, quote, "Given that we still know very little about the origins of the universe and the nature of the human mind, atheists' certainty that the universe is merely physical and that nothing transcendent exists is clearly a belief system in its own right," end quote. So this is what I'm saying, but they don't realize that it's a frame of meaning, that it's an epistemological framework, that it is not the only one and it is not the ultimate one. And finally, the negative point is that there are several stages beyond it and it doesn't recognize this, as I've said, but I just want to make this very clear. Secular spirituality, the modern worldview, is a stage we go through. It is not the ultimate one. And we do not realize that neither in education nor politics, nor none of the atheistic writers recognize this, but it is a fact. Alright, so I hope you've enjoyed learning about secular spirituality. I hope this shines a light on your own faith development, your own trajectory. And I really hope you're inspired to learn more. Please head back to the previous episodes that I've published this month on the levels of spirituality. And of course, please join me next Sunday for my episode on progressive postmodern spirituality. Thanks a lot for joining me at the Deep Psychology Podcast. I'm Ross, and I'll see you very soon for more. Thanks for listening. If you liked this episode, please leave a review and make sure to subscribe on Apple or Spotify. If you'd like to go deeper with this work, head to deep-psychology.com to do coaching with me. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you soon.